Welcome back to the Inner World Podcast, everyone. Today, I am joined by Mark Sewell, who is an FBI agent, or retired FBI special agent, who has a book coming out called Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club, the FBI, the Gold Club, and the Mafia. I mean, can you think of a better title than that for a book that we would talk about? I cannot. But yeah, we are trying to get back into the swing of things of doing these interviews and bonus episodes for you guys every week, every other week. We've definitely been slacking this summer, but you know how it is in summer. But yeah, this was an interesting one. Mark's got a lot to say, and I think the book goes into a lot more detail. And yeah, that's all I'll say for now. Thanks for joining us. Thanks for subscribing again to everyone who's listening here. And thanks to Ryan, who messaged us on Instagram and told us to get in contact with Mark. Thanks so much for that. We really appreciate it. Mark, just want to thank you so much for joining us. It's a hell of a great title for a book, Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club. So, I think anyone that reads that or hears that is going to be interested in what you have to say and what went on. Why don't we start off by just kind of setting the scene a bit? You joined the FBI in 1997. What was your background and what had you been doing?
My background before joining the FBI, and first of all, thanks for having me, Danny. Yeah, sure. I appreciate your invite. Was I had been in the Marines for almost 10 years, 9 years and some change. I was an intelligence officer when I joined the FBI, and I came straight in, left the Marine Corps and transitioned straight into the FBI. And since retirement, which has been 6 years now, I still teach for the FBI as a contract instructor at one of their schools located near Quantico, Virginia.
So 1997, I mean, you're technically a rookie, but it wasn't like you were unfamiliar with, dealing with dangerous organizations or investigation or things of that nature. How does the Gold Club investigation, how does it land, in your lap, basically?
I was assigned right out of the academy to the Atlanta office, to the Atlanta division of the FBI. And that office had just created an organized crime squad to tackle a growing problem in Atlanta, which was organized crime and strip clubs together, coincidentally, because that's where the organized crime was. It was in the adult entertainment business of Atlanta. Atlanta is notorious for adult entertainment clubs because they allow both full nudity and full alcohol, which is unusual throughout the United States. Only two other states, Texas and Florida, allow both full nudity and full alcohol. So I was assigned to that squad as a new agent, and an agent on that squad, what I call a Hoover agent, an old-timer who came into the FBI when J. Edgar Hoover was still the director, had already opened the case on the Gold Club because he knew that Steve Kaplan was connected to the Gambinos, and he was waiting for some manpower to be shifted over to the squad from other squads from the academy, in my case, to help him because it was more than just a one-man job.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like these sort of, I would assume, like high-class strip clubs are always a target for enforcement agencies. In New York, of course, we have Scores, and then, of course, the Sopranos, I think the stereotype is relatively accurate. Mafia running, managing a strip club and doing a lot of business there. I mean, is that kind of, not always, but is that a relatively accurate generalization?
It is. And let me tell you why, especially during that era, the era that the Sopranos is set in, the era that Scores and the Gold Club were notorious, is because the clubs were still operating with enough cash that it made it lucrative to organized crime to be able to skim from that cash. Today, other than the dancers perhaps who get $1 and $5 thrown at them, the majority of the door admissions, the alcohol, and all the things that go with the trappings of a strip club today are probably going to be put on a credit card or a debit card. but not so in the 80s, 90s. It was still enough cash to make organized crime interested.
And set the scene, like describe the Gold Club. We're not talking about, something in a strip mall off the highway here. It's a very high class, high clientele, or extremely wealthy clientele establishment. So what sort of people were going to the Gold Club?
Well, we had a cooperating defendant who testified at trial that was probably the number 2 or number 3 man in management there at the Gold Club, and a longtime Steve Kaplan associate from New York. And he described the Gold Club in the terms that Steve Kaplan wanted to create it, which was Studio 54. So it was a high tech, high atmosphere, high energy type of environment. Everything from the glittering balls that hang from the ceiling to the loud thumping music to bright lights to multiple stages to girls wearing costumes. The clientele you ask about, it was a joint. Nobody was turned away, that's for sure. But it certainly trended toward upper middle class, people with money. There was 2 levels to the club. You had a main level that you would walk in on, and then there was a second level that was for VIPs only. And there was actually rooms up there. The VIP rooms are what they called the gold rooms. And I believe there were 12 of those, as many as 12 at one time. And to get upstairs, obviously, cost a lot of money. Just to rent one of the smallest rooms was $200 an hour. And then there would be a mandatory champagne fee on that for another $100. And then you had to negotiate the girl for an hour. So that would be at a minimum of another $100. So you're at $400 for the first hour in 1999 when you buy or rent a gold room. Most of the working class probably would have stayed downstairs, and they would have been the majority. But the high rollers were upstairs, and they were spending lots of money.
And from reading about the trial, I mean, these high rollers, we're talking celebrities, entertainers, rappers, and athletes. I mean, when you see who took the stand or was talked about during the trial, it's like a who's who of all the best 90s NBA players, especially, my team, the Knicks. We had Patrick Ewing involved, John Starks, and everything like that. So were you having to look into, contact these people, reach out to them and deal with that?
Yes. When we put together the charging instrument, which was a RICO indictment, one of the predicates in the RICO indictment was prostitution, ITAR, interstate transportation and aid of racketeering. It's prostitution that involved an instrument that crossed state lines. In this case, it would have been credit cards, or the business itself was an interstate commerce business. And so because we were investigating interstate prostitution, yes, that's where the celebrities came in. They were the ones most notoriously involved in the prostitution. But to be clear, they, for the most part, weren't paying for it. They were a tool that Steve Kaplan used to bring in everyone else. Steve had developed a kind of a plan that I will attract the commoners to the Gold Club to spend lots of money because they can hang out with Dennis Rodman, who I will allow in the club free, and I'll pay for his champagne, and I'll pay for his gold room, and I'll pay for the services that he has with a girl to include sex. Anything Dennis Rodman wants, it's on the house. But all that money that I'm spending, Steve Kaplan would say, I'll make back tenfold because it's going to attract so many other common people who want to go to the Gold Club and hang out with Dennis Rodman and hang out with Patrick Ewing and John Starks. So that was, yes, it was notorious with celebrities, but the majority of them were not paying for their services.
So we keep mentioning Steve Kaplan. He was the owner operator of the Gold Club. How does he, how do you become this guy who is running this high level mafia connected strip club? Where did he come from, and how did he sort of rise to the top?
Sure. Steve first made the attention of the Gambinos in the mid 1980s when he owned some nightclubs in and around New York, to include in Manhattan, to include out in a couple of the boroughs as well. Steve would buy a club, make it a moneymaker, and then sell it. That was his tool to move up the financially up to bigger clubs and bigger clubs. He did that, I think, 3 times, maybe 4 in the New York area. And then he moved down to South Florida, still maintaining his residence and his other businesses at Penn Station. He moved the nightclub business down to Florida in Boca Raton and bought a club down there. Now it's even bigger. It's even more glitzy. Then he cashed that in. He actually had a couple clubs down there. Let me back up. And then one was Heaven and one was Club Boca. Cashed those in, took that money, bought the Gold Club in Atlanta before the Olympics in 1994, because he knew it would be a moneymaker with the Olympics coming to town in 1996 with all the infrastructure buildup of Atlanta, the sports teams rolling through there. So by the time we opened a case on him around the Olympics in 1996, Steve had been with the Gambinos for over a decade, and he had been through about 8 or 10 of these type of nightclubs and businesses before he landed at the Gold Club.
And what sort of so he opens his club up in 1994. We're saying he's kind of affiliated with the Gambinos. Are they involved right off the bat when he's opening up this club? Do they come in later? How does that relationship work?
Yeah, from day one, there was always a mob presence at the Gold Club. Witnesses would testify at trial, for example, that Michael DeLeonardo was a regular at the Gold Club. Michael was now Steve's handler as a Gambino Captain. If you back up down to South Florida, John Gotti Jr. was a regular at Club Boca. John Gotti Jr. did not want to be seen in a strip club. So if my memory is right, he was never in Atlanta to visit the Gold Club. Mikey Scars, Michael DeLeonardo, was. He would go to the Gold Club. He would sit up in a VIP room, but he was treated different. He wasn't necessarily interested in having a girl dance for him. When he was there, he would just have a girl sit with him and talk, for an hour or so. And it really was just casual conversation. And then, of course, Michael DeLeonardo had other guys with him that were mob related. Craig Carlino from Scores would come and visit the club, for example, and these were all mob associates. So from 1994, there was always a presence there because Steve would invite these guys to come on up, or come on down in this case, and visit the club. And then, of course, the catch was the cash from the club was being kicked back up to New York.
Right. So were they extorting Steve, or were they kind of partners? Were they laundering money through it? How does that relationship work?
Yeah, good question. At trial, Steve Kaplan's defense attorney tried on a couple different defenses with the media. First, it was, hey, we don't know anything about the mob. This is all crazy. This is government craziness. And then later, as we produced evidence at trial, it was, okay, so Steve Kaplan and his kids go to the same school that John Gotti Jr.'s kids go to, and that's how they know each other. And then maybe a few weeks later, as we produced more evidence, then Steve Kaplan was a victim of the mob. He had been shook down by the mob since the 1980s. And I think that's more to your question. Was he a victim of the mob? Was he extorted, and et cetera? Probably, Danny, better than me, being a New York resident, that sometimes the mob will come knocking and say, hey, let's strike up a business relationship that you can't refuse. And in exchange for that, you'll get our protection so that the Bonanos or the Lucchese's won't come around and do the same thing, or a street gang try and harass you and shake you down. You have our protection. And Steve was okay with that. For all the evidence showed that for 10 years, he didn't mind paying for that type of protection. It was a mutual relationship of respect between there. We never had any evidence that the mob was mad at Steve Kaplan for anything, or, hey, if you don't pay, you're going to get your legs broken, that type of thing. He appreciated the benefit of having those guys as his big brother within the business.
How does the investigation into a club like this start? Are you going in there? Are you sending in people undercover? Are you staking it out? Are you starting to go through paperwork and financials? What's the sort of opening salvo when you guys are looking to take down this a strip club that's corrupt like this and involved in all these sort of financial crimes?
Well, to go back to the very original salvo, to use your word, it was from New York. The FBI there picked up the phone basically and called down to Atlanta in 1994 and said, hey, one of our top level associates, Steve Kaplan, who was in John Gotti Jr.'s crew, now in Michael DeLeonardo's crew, just bought a club down in Atlanta, and we want you to know about it. And that's the way the FBI does business. If we know that there's crime occurring in your district or some of our criminals have moved to your district, we'll give you a courtesy call and let you know. And sure enough, Steve had bought that club in 1994 in Atlanta. And that's when I was telling you earlier that the Hoover agent opened a case, a formal case with paperwork on that, and said, "Hey, we've got this guy in town, and now we're gonna look and see what he's doing." And initially, the evidence that was started to roll in was from informants saying just what you mentioned earlier, that there was a lot of prostitution going on at the club, that there's a lot of mobsters hanging out at the club. But then we started getting telephone complaints and walk-in complaints at the FBI office from credit card victims. And these credit card victims were the likes of, "Hey, I thought I spent $5,000 last night, but when I got home, American Express called me and said, no, you spent $25,000. And these were becoming common, to the tune of maybe as much as once a month, with these pretty outlandish dollar figures for a couple of years. And we would take their reports and we would start to catalog these and realize that credit card fraud is occurring. We would work with our informants and we would go out and do some overt interviews of former employees. And they would tell us that, yes, this credit card fraud was occurring and it was orchestrated by the management from the very top. Steve Kaplan was teaching this fraud to the dancers, to the managers on how to perpetrate it. And so those are the things that caught our attention in the beginning. And of course, with the prostitution, with the credit card fraud comes money laundering and tax issues. So we knew where that was going to take us eventually as well.
Yeah, it just seems kind of sloppy, if you're doing all that other stuff to get into something as pretty, obvious, or as just the kind of thing that's going to get a lot of attention, like that credit card fraud. I assume, they are assuming that the kind of person that's going to spend $5,000 maybe doesn't check their credit card and see that it's $10,000, or is too drunk or something like that, or is embarrassed to alert law enforcement. But it just seems like the kind of thing that if you're perpetuating a whole bunch of other crimes, you probably should try to keep that one off the radar, but they just can't seem to help themselves, can they?
Yeah, you're right, Danny. That's a great point and a great question built into it. In the beginning, the Gold Club's philosophy was we will stiff arm all of these complaints and we'll make it very difficult for the complainer to get any traction. And they had a couple techniques that they had developed on that. One of them was, "Hey, you sure don't want us to call your wife and let her know about this by mistake, do you?" So that was one of the techniques they used. And then sometimes the customer's like, "Hey, I don't give a rat's ass if you call my wife or not. Or, by the way, I'm not married. But yeah, we're going to settle this." So what we found shortly at trial is they had corrupted, they being the Gold Club, an American Express employee who would deny these chargebacks when those chargebacks were funneled to that person's desk. And yes, you're right, it is sloppy. It brought them a lot of unnecessary attention. Steve Kaplan was making $9 million a year at the club. It was the number one grossing strip club in America, legitimately. Anything he made beyond that was just greed. So why is the rhetorical question, do I want to bring all this heat on me for extra when I can just play it by the rules and make $9 million a year?
Yeah, it just, I don't know. I think, people get arrogant and they think that they can get away with it. And it kind of probably seems like, we'll just do this once in a while to someone every couple of weeks and no one will be any the wiser. But it clearly didn't end up that way.
No.
Are there any other particular sort of stories that you remember involving, celebrities or these sort of outrageous transactions that were happening there?
Yes. There's quite a few. One or two that comes to mind is the famous, or maybe infamous, Madonna story. And Steve advertised a lot like the Las Vegas clubs advertised. If you've been to Vegas, you've been to the Strip, Danny, those little 3x5 cards that are laying all over the ground.
Yeah.
That are advertising girls or date connections or whatever it might be. Well, Steve advertised like that as well. And he had a couple of managers that would take the club limousine at nighttime, take a couple dancers, roll into downtown Atlanta, go to a hotel, go to a sporting event, go to some place where there were lots of men and just hand out these cards. And these cards were public free admission front door waiver of the fee of, I think it was either $10 at that time. So you bring this card in, you don't have to pay $10, and maybe it's even good for your buddy, good for one other. So that's how he got a lot of people in the front door, is just by handing out these cards. Where on these cards was especially during the latter years around 98, 99, was a dancer, a very pretty girl, and she went by the stage name of Baby, Baby. And she was in a red bikini, and she was striking a pose on these little cards. And so she became very famous. She became the face of the Gold Club because she was out there in the tens of thousands on these cards. Well, Madonna came in one night after a concert, and Baby happened to be working that night, and Madonna went to management and said, "I want Baby to leave the club with me and go back to my hotel." Well, the first person that Madonna asked this to was a manager who was not in the know, was not in the clique, and he said, "No, sorry, ma'am, can't do that. That's against the rules." Well, then another manager overruled him and said, "You know what? That is within the rules, and that's okay." So ultimately, Baby ended up leaving the club, as we were told at trial by some witnesses who were there and authorized it, left that club with Madonna, and it created a lot of buzz in the club. One, that Madonna was there, and two, that she left with Baby. So that's one that comes to mind. Probably the other one right off the top is my interview of Dennis Rodman, who I mentioned earlier. When I interviewed Dennis to get him ready for his grand jury testimony, because we had subpoenaed him to the grand jury, he showed up on a Saturday morning in his limousine. We were going to do that interview on a Saturday morning at the courthouse when the courthouse was empty, to avoid media and celebrity attention and things of that. That's kind of the deal we struck with Dennis and his attorney, that we'll bring you in on a Saturday morning, do the interview, and nobody will ever know. So he rolls in around 9 o'clock that morning. When he gets when the chauffeur limousine driver gets out, walks around to the back of the limousine and opens the door to let Dennis out, me and my partner are standing there waiting on him to escort him into the building. Carmen Electra is laying over on his shoulder asleep. And when Dennis gets out of the limousine, Carmen just falls right over onto the back seat and never wakes up. She just passed out, just plops right there on the back seat. So you don't see Carmen passed out in the back of a limo often, right? So then we take Dennis upstairs and we start the interview, and he has 3 rings in each nostril and 3 rings in each ear. So he's got 12 rings in his face while I'm doing this interview with him. And he's just adamant, unlike the other celebrities, unlike the other athletes, that he doesn't need Steve Kaplan to arrange prostitution for him. Because after all, didn't you just see who was in the back seat of his limousine 30 minutes earlier? And so unlike, and there was lots of girls who told us at trial, I had sex with Dennis Rodman. And Dennis Rodman didn't deny that. But Dennis was convinced it's because he is Dennis Rodman. That's why people had sex with him.
I mean, it's being like pointing to Carmen Electra and being like, look, it's a decent defense. I give him I give him props right. for trying. He might not have been aware of everything. So yeah, this is already, celebs, pop stars, mafia. There was also, from what I understand, there were, and not just the American Express employee, but there were local cops that were also on the take. Yeah.
There was, and that was something that I was personally involved in investigating. As we started doling out investigative responsibilities among the team members, I was assigned to most of the Atlanta crimes. One of my partners had the New York crimes. One of my partner had the Miami crimes. I had the Atlanta crimes, and we discovered that there were 2 Atlanta police officers that were intimately familiar with Steve Kaplan, would hang out at the club. Employees would tell us that they would come in both in uniform and out of uniform. They were comped, given free services. On birthdays, the limousine would come and pick them up at their house and take them out in town for birthday parties. I mean, they were just celebrities at the club almost. One of these officers worked in the permits unit that was responsible for regulating the adult clubs in Atlanta. And we had a half a dozen witnesses at trial, for example, tell the jury that they answered the telephone when that police officer called the club and told them, hey, there's a surprise inspection coming tonight. And they all pointed him out. They knew who he was. They recognized his voice. Sometimes he'd even say, "Hey, this is Bernie. Tell Steve that an inspection is coming tonight." And sure enough, the inspection would come that night. That police officer was acquitted at trial. For whatever reason, the jury didn't buy it. But that was police officer number one. The other one was a police officer who was not assigned directly to anything involving the club. He didn't work that zone. He didn't work that district, but his wife had been a Gold Club dancer previously and a Gold Club employee. Later, she became what's known as a house mom, where she is someone who manages the dancers back in the locker room. She's taking care of getting them out on the stage at the right time and getting them to work at the right time and so forth. That police officer became intimately involved in a rape allegation that happened at the club, in the club limousine, by one of the club managers and one of the dancers. It was a he said, she said. They were the only two witnesses to that event that night, other than the driver of the limousine, who, of course, he had the partition up when he's driving, so he didn't see what happened in the back, but he had some incriminating evidence afterwards. Well, that police officer was called by Steve Kaplan and said, "Hey, here's the problem. Tell us how to handle this." And he advised Steve Kaplan, the limousine driver, and others how to obstruct that investigation, how to destroy evidence, things to say to the sex crimes unit that were lies and so forth. He instructed one of the witnesses at trial to lie about this and lie about that and so forth. Now, he never made it to trial because that police officer, this case was severed, Danny, in half, meaning that 8 defendants went to trial first and then the remaining 9 would go to trial later. That police officer that I'm describing to you about the rape was in the second trial, and that second trial never happened because the plea that happened in month 4 of the first trial was negotiated to include all those other defendants in trial number 2. And part of that plea negotiation, which in hindsight was very disappointing, that the U.S. Attorney's Office struck, was that police officer, charge against him for obstructing that rape would be dismissed if he resigned his police certification for 4 years. And he took that deal and he got out of police work for 4 years. But today, as we speak, he's still a police officer in another district and another zone. So he came back into law enforcement.
Wow. So, I mean, yeah, speaking of the trial, so we've got corrupt police officers, we've got strippers, New York mobsters, pop stars, professional athletes. Was it just a complete circus? Was there a ton of media attention? I also read that you were facing against like 18 defense attorneys as well.
Yeah. So remember, I mentioned to you there were 17 defendants in this case. Yeah. So when we would have pretrial motions, all the defendants would be there, for example, when they wanted to suppress certain evidence and so forth. Steve Kaplan had 2 attorneys himself. So that's where we get the 18, is we had 17 plus 1. One of those was a mob attorney who ended up getting convicted for obstructing in our case and witness tampering after the trial was over with. And you're right, it was an absolute circus. Everybody from Jay Leno to David Letterman to Sports Illustrated, the Time Magazine to Washington Post to the LA Times to the New York Post, you name it, National Enquirer, you name it, Jim Rome and so forth wanted to advertise and talk about this case. If not for the mafia connection, it was certainly for the sports athlete connection. So yeah, it was a circus. The case got hijacked. My original partner that started this case has a famous line that I repeat in the book a couple times. Early in the case, he looked at me and he said, "Mark, this case is like the bar scene at Star Wars." And that was exactly right. You remember that scene with Jabba the Hutt, right? Yeah,
the cantina. Yeah.
Yes. You walk in and there's 20 different characters there and they're all 20 different. That was the lineup at the Gold Club.
Yeah, I mean, when I was doing research for this, I looked it up, and there was an article from Bill Simmons, the sports guy, had written, I think, about the trial and recapping basically all the things involving NBA players, where I saw a lot of stuff about my beloved '90s New York Knicks. But yeah, I mean, it must have been something. I'm glad we finally have a book on the subject. I also had read that it was the most successful financial operation for the FBI at the time. Is that accurate?
Concerning organized crime. So the negotiated plea included Steve Kaplan admitting his guilt, forfeiting the club, And so you count up the money that was associated with the club, paying a $5 million fine outright to the government, and then also paying restitution to Delta Airlines for the fraud that he had committed against them over the last 10 years, and then also paying restitution to the credit card victims that had come forward as well. And when you add all that money up at the end of the trial, at the end of the case, which we did, it was the most successful financial forfeiture against an organized crime member up until that date. Yeah, sure was.
That's, that's got to count for something, right? I know the second trial didn't happen, but you've got to be, I guess, proud of that number.
Well, the number was impressive. We closed the club. That was the most important thing, because that was the money maker that was being funneled back up to the Gambinos. The defendants in the second trial, they were part of that plea negotiation. I think there were 14 of the 17 who took a felony plea, and the other 2 went to trial. They went all the way to the jury, and that was Michael DeLeonardo, Mikey Scars, and that was the police officer that worked in the permits unit. They were acquitted by the jury, and so that's how we got 14 felony convictions. We got the club, and we got about $10 million in forfeiture.
And that's all, the entire details of all this, everything is in the book that just came out, Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club by Mark Sewell. So definitely go get that if you guys are interested in learning more. Before we leave off, I just want to ask you a couple more questions, because I know we had talked about this, and it's something we've covered on the show recently, outlaw motorcycle gangs, in this case, specifically the Outlaws. You were involved in an operation that took them down in North Georgia, yeah?
I was. I spent 10 years in Atlanta working organized crime, and then I volunteered to transfer up to North Georgia into a smaller office, a 4-man FBI office up there that handled local crimes in the northern territory of Georgia. And we started to encounter motorcycle gangs up there, or specifically just one, but their support clubs were there as well. And it was a problem, where there was drug trafficking, there was firearms violations, and et cetera. So I created an undercover operation, brought in an FBI undercover agent with the use of some informants. We ran an undercover for almost 2 years against the Outlaws, against their support clubs. We even found a nexus with Sir 13, Sureños, a Mexican street gang, wanted to start dealing drugs with the Outlaws. So we figured out a way to put those 2 criminal organizations together. And so when we took the case down, we arrested 31 individuals, 23 bikers, if my memory's right, and then the remaining 8 would have been Sureño members.
Now, is that detailed in your book, or is the second book that we're gonna
No,
see?
It's not going to be the second book, but it's not in this book either. Coincidentally, I am working with a film studio who wants to try and maybe turn this into a documentary.
Oh, yeah. I think it's also perfect for, a movie in general, like not even a documentary, like a fictionalized movie. You can't, 90s NBA players, mafia, strip clubs, all this. It's, it's exciting stuff. And I think people would be drawn to it for sure.
Well, I was referring to the motorcycle matter.
Oh, the motorcycle stuff.
You asked about that, if that was going to be in the second book.
Yeah.
No, that's being worked in a documentary. Okay. And yes, there's interest out there as well that I'm talking with some impressive players about taking something from the Gold Club and either making that big screen or what they call a long form docuseries as well. We'll just have to see how that shakes out, but we're having good conversations.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, Mark, and taking the time to lay this stuff out and let us know about this investigation. Like I said, for those who are interested, you can get the book, I think, anywhere, right? Amazon, Barnes & Nobles, all that.
That's right. Mm-hmm.
Investigating America's Most Notorious Strip Club.
That's right.
That's it. Yeah. Great. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Mark.
You're very welcome. Thank you, Danny.